Hi Realtors, this is Lindsay Jackson, your Chief Advocacy Officer at SCR. The legislature has just completed the first year of a 2-year session. We are just now finishing the session as both chambers have just recently reached a consensus on the state budget. This has been an unprecedented session, marking the first time in many years that the General Assembly has adjourned without a sine die resolution. A sine die resolution is basically a document that governs what the General Assembly can and can't take up in the interim before the next legislative session. With no agreement in the interim, the governor held the ability to call the legislature back into session at any given time, which he did a few times over the course of the summer. The first year of the session has been overshadowed by many political hot-button issues. This year, like every year, thousands of pieces of legislation are filed and only few actually gain traction. So this has a lot to do with it being the first year of a 2-year session, but we can't discount how national politics impact activities at the state level. Some examples of national issues taken up at the state level include education scholarship accounts, bond reform, heartbeat legislation, and fentanyl trafficking legislation. The nearly $14 billion budget was a major source of contention between the House and the Senate this session. While the differences were minimal, both sides held their ground fighting for their version of the appropriations bill. The Budget Conference Committee met multiple times over the summer and were finally able to reach a consensus. Highlights of the budget include teacher pay raises for law enforcement, $200 million to the Office of Resilience for disaster relief and projects that reduce flood risk, and nearly $50 million to buy and preserve land in the state. After the passage of the budget, the governor did issue a few vetoes, but the House and Senate do not plan to return to Columbia until the beginning of the 2024 session next year. Now let's focus on Realtor priorities. Despite everything else that was going on at the State House this session, SCR was still able to make strides in ensuring that our priorities were in front of members of the General Assembly. First off, S-284, Accommodations Tax for Workforce Housing. This legislation allows state and local accommodations taxes to be used for the development of workforce housing. The bill includes a 7-year sunset provision and creates a land development study committee to examine current and prospective methods to plan for and manage land development in the state. This legislation taps into an additional funding stream and is a great first step in ensuring more attainable housing in the state. The governor signed this legislation into law on May the 19th. Next, let's focus on S-399, DHEC restructuring. Effective July 1st, 2024, this legislation splits DHEC into 2 newly formed agencies, the Department of Environmental Services and the Department of Public Health. Of significance to the regulated community, this legislation effectively consolidates all environmental permitting and planning within one state agency. Separating health and environmental matters will benefit consumers through a more streamlined use of resources. The governor also signed this legislation into law on May the 19th. Issues we've made progress on this session and will continue to focus on next session include H3253, short-term rentals. This legislation would prohibit municipalities from outright bans on short-term rentals while still allowing the municipality to propose and enforce appropriate ordinances relating to quality of life. Short-term rentals are a vital part of South Carolina's housing economy with a current economic impact of $4.2 billion annually. H3253 protects an individual's rights from local overreach while also creating fair rules and providing mechanisms to enhance accountability and transparency via tax remittance. This bill received 2 hearings in a House 3M subcommittee but was ultimately not given a vote. This legislation will be up for debate in the 2024 legislative session. Another issue that moved forward this session was H4247, dealing with unfair service agreements. This legislation was filed by Representative Randy Ligon to address long-term marketing and listing agreements towards the end of the legislative session. This legislation prohibits the recording of unfair service agreements and deems them unfair if they meet certain criteria, meaning they last more than a year, they purport to run with the land or be binding on future owners, or create a lien or encumbrance. This bill was assigned to the House LCI Committee and will be taken up next session. So that wraps up the 2023 session. SCR is already looking ahead and planning for the 2024 session. Some preliminary issues for the 2024 session include tackling unfair service agreements, creating an administrative removal of discriminatory covenants and restrictions, reauthorizing the moratorium to stop private companies from using eminent domain, and a few licensure updates. I'd like to thank the 2023 Legislative Committee and Chair Brian Kynard for all of their hard work this session. And thank you all for trusting me to represent you at the State House, and thank you all for your continued support this session.